In this video, we're going to take a look at the process of using a scan coming from the HPZ 3D camera and texturing that here in Substance Painter. So here I have my project set up. This is using the mesh that was scanned from the HPZ 3D camera. And I'm going to start by working with the normal map that was produced by the HPZ. So here I'm going to create a fill layer, and I'm going to call this normal. And I'm just going to disable all of these channels that I have here except for my normal, and I'm going to click this button here, and I'm starting to filter my mini shelf here based on project, which allows me to get to the images that I've imported into this project. And here I'm working with the normal map that was produced again by the HPZ. So here you can see we have the normal applied. So when I take a look at this, I can see that, well, I have some seam problems, and I can fix those here in Substance Painter. So to do that, I'm going to come over and create a standard layer, and this is a paintable layer, and I'll call this normal fix. And I'm going to target here the normal channel and set its blending mode to pass through. So now if I come over here to my tools, I'm going to use this clone tool, and I can actually start to do some cloning here on this normal vector data. So here I'm just going to sample this region here, and then what I can do is just start to kind of paint these sample vectors and just paint over that seam so I can fix any issues that I have in the normal map. And Painter's a good tool to correct any of these map issues. So here you can see I'm just going to go through the process of just cleaning up some of this normal data. Now I can produce some ambient occlusion information from this fixed normal map. So here if I look at my texture set settings, I have an ambient occlusion channel that was created. So here I'm just going to add a filter, and for this filter I'm just going to do a quick search here for the horizon-based ambient occlusion, and I'll add this here and switch the channel source to normal. So now it's going to generate this ambient occlusion based on this normal information, and I can play around with my radius here as well as my height depth. And let's see, if we take a look at what we're getting here, if we look at our individual channel for this, let's come over here to our ambient occlusion. This is what we're producing here from this filter based on the normal, which also is being generated from this fixed normal map layer. Okay, so now we'll hit M on the keyboard again to go back to our material mode, and we have some ambient occlusion data that we can work with. Now we need to generate some more data about this mesh that we can use throughout the texturing process. And to do that, I'm going to use the original normal map that was imported from the HPZ, and I'm going to generate some additional maps such as curvature, world space, and position. So now what I'm going to do is come back here to my texture set settings, and here I'm just going to apply that normal map. Now this normal map is being added to the mesh map so I can use it here with the baker. Since I'm actually using the normal map here in my layer stack, I've set the normal mixing to replace. So now let's come over here again to our texture set settings and let's bake some maps. Here I'm going to bake world space, curvature, and position. And here I'm going to use the low poly mesh as high poly mesh enabled, and since I don't have a high res mesh, it's going to generate the world space and curvature based on this normal map. So I'll just bake these really quick. You'll see that Painter bakes these maps out and places them here into the mesh map section. All right, so now that we have that in place, I'm just going to toggle this layer here so I can just refresh the viewport, and now I'm ready to begin the texturing process. So here I have some pre-made smart materials that I've created, and these smart materials are really just a preset or collection of a layer stack that I created when I started setting up this project. So for example, if we take this shoe metal plastic, I'm just going to drag and drop this here into my layer stack. You can see that it starts to apply the material here in a specific section of my shoe. This material is being placed via this mask. So if we look at the mask here in the viewport, this is what we're getting. Now let's take a look at this actual mask. You can see here I'm using the mask editor with the curvature set to 1, and I've adjusted some of the settings. Now if we scroll down, you can see that my mesh maps that I've generated here, the world space, and I have my position and curvature. Now the curvature and world space, like I said, was converted from that normal map that came from the HPZ. This curvature and world space allows me to work with something like the mask generator, which helps me to procedurally create a mask. So here in this case, again, you can see that I have my curvature, And if we take a look at this, I'm just using curvature, again being generated by that mesh map data to quickly create a mask in all the raised areas of the shoe. Then on top of that, I have a paint layer that I've added that allowed me to just mask out any troublesome areas here in my mask. So here you can see this is what I got from the original curvature, and then I quickly added a paint effect that allows me to paint in real time here in the viewport to refine this mask. Now I've anchored all of this mask data here that you see in the viewport so that I can use this later with another material, basically to help me in that material blending process. So now we'll go back to the material mode, and you can see that now that I've set this up, I can now go back and make any changes. So for example, let's say that I want to change the color of this material. I can do so very interactively here inside of Painter. For now, we're just going to keep the same color that we had by default, and let's add a new material. Next, I'm going to add this shoe gray leather. So we'll drag and drop and place this here into the top of the layer stack, and you can see that once again, this material is being placed in a specific area of the shoe. Let's take a look at the mask. So again, I'll Alt left click. This is the mask that's being generated for me using the same technique. I use the mask editor, which is creating a curvature mask derived from my world space, position, and curvature information. Really, it's using my world space and curvature. Now, the next thing that I'm going to do here, if I come over to my mask editor, you can see here for my curvature, this time the mode is set to cavity. So instead of being on the curvature of the shape, again, dictated by that normal map coming from the HPZ, it's more concentrated on these flat areas. So this is what it looked like before. You can see I have these white areas. Then I used a paint effect to actually go in and refine these areas so that I get the mask exactly the way that I would like. And I do a blur on top of that just to kind of blur out some of those edges. And then once again, I'm going to anchor this point down so that I can reuse this a little bit later when I add a third material. So for now, if we take a look, this is what we're getting here for our material blending. Now let's add another material on top. This time we're going to add this shoe technical fabric. Now to create this material, so here by default you can see it's just covering everything. What I've done is here inside of Painter, I jumped over to Substance Source and I downloaded this technical fabric, which is part of the Substance Source library. So you can easily jump into Source, find the material that you want, and download that directly here to your project. So I've added this here to my project, and I've also made some changes to this material, which we'll cover here in just a moment. But for now, we need to create our mask. So let me show you a way that we can work with that anchored data. Here I'm going to right click and choose to create a black mask. Now I'm going to create a fill, and this fill gives me this grayscale value that I can then open up my shelf and go to my anchor points. Now here you can see that I have these anchor points as being highlighted here in my layer stack, which like I told you before, we're going to use that mask data that we created to help me create another mask on top. This also keeps all of my layers linked together, so when I make a change in one layer, it will automatically update through all the material blending that I'm going to have set up. So here we're going to start by using this metallic plastic mask, and I'm going to scroll down here to this levels control, and I'm going to simply just click the invert button. So now you can see that I've already started to use the mask that I created before under the shoe metal plastic. I've anchored that, and now I'm reusing that again here to create another blend. So here's what we have so far. So now we need to mask out another section. Well, instead of hand painting all that to start, I always try to do things a bit procedurally just to get me, a good 70% of the way there before I have to do any hand painting work. So what I'm going to do here at this stage again is add another fill. This time we're going to come over to the anchor, and I'm going to use this gray leather mask. So I have this in place, and now each one of these fills has its own set of blending modes. So I'm simply going to set this to subtract. And now you can see that I'm starting to place this material in the areas that I want it to be in. Now on top of this, of course, I could add another paint here. And let me just come over to my shelf. And let me grab my brushes here. So you can see I'm just navigating in my shelf to my brushes. And I'm just going to grab this basic soft brush. And I can go in, you can see I can start to refine this by just masking this value in and out as I go in. So any kind of areas in the mask that just aren't perfect, I can go in and refine those if I want. So we'll undo that for now, and we won't worry too much about that mask at this stage. So now let's go back here to my shelf, and I'm going to look at my smart materials, and I'm going to add my shoe soles here to the very top of my layer stack here as well. And so now you can see that I have these shoe soles, which of course again are using the same kind of masking techniques that we've talked about before to create a mask, and this helps me to set up all of my material blending. And like I said, the way that I have this set up, if I want to make any changes to any of the work that I've done here in the layer stack, it's all set up to be procedurally linked. So any changes will automatically update. If I make a change to the shoe metal plastic, like for example, if I come in and paint on this, since it's been anchored and passed up through to this technical fabric, it will automatically update. So here, I'm gonna come back here to this technical fabric layer, and I'm gonna come over to the material, and I can start to play around and make some changes to this. So like I said, this is a substance from source, so we have some presets here. So if I wanna change the preset, I can do that. I could also come into here and start to make some changes. So maybe we'll set this here to something more like this. Let's see what we have here. Or actually here, let's change these values like this. So we can get something more like a material that looks with this two-tone kind of color. We have this blue and this black, and you can see it's real easy to make these changes interactively as you work. So again, here I'm just going to maybe switch this back, not the light gray, but let's do this one here. Okay, so now we're going to use this preset. All right, so the next thing we're going to do is create some stitching, and I'm going to show you how to do this in a procedural manner. So what we're going to do is we're going to first create a fill layer, and I'm going to, let's see, we're going to enable our height. We're going to have our color, our roughness. We don't need these last three channels. For the color, let's just lower this gray value a small bit. Let's increase our roughness. And for our height, let's set this value pretty high. You can see I'm using a positive height. So this here is going to be our stitching. Now, what I like to do is keep this as a fill layer. That means that these base values like uniform color, my roughness, and my height, I will be able to change at any time after the process of painting the stitching through a mask. So here I'm going to right click, create a black mask, and then for the mask, I'm going to use the paint effect. So now I need to set up my brush. So for the alpha shape, here I have a stitch alpha that we ship with Substance Painter. I'm going to use this guy. This is a stitch generator. And then if we come into here, also I need to come over to my brush. I'm gonna look at my spacing. I need to set my spacing here. And let's also use, let's say, a follow path. So I'm gonna set my size here for this brush. And let me just do a quick stroke here. And you can see I'm starting to create some stitching like this. Now, like I said, I've made a stroke, and it's done on this paint effect, which is feeding up to a mask that we're creating. This mask is for a fill layer. So that means I can go back, and let's say I want to make red stitch or green stitch or something like that. I can do that. Here in this case, I'm just going to set this to be, close to a white value. I can also change the roughness amount and so on. So like I said, working this way allows me to keep this procedural. Also, let's say the height is a little too intense. I can easily just interactively back this down, or I could even push into the surface if I like by using a negative height value. Okay, so at this time, we'll go back here to our paint effect, and you can see here, if I just get my brush size appropriate for the shoe, I can go in and just start to paint stitches here like this. Now I'm going to go through the process of doing this for the entire shoe. All right, so here at this stage, we have some stitching in place. And what I'm gonna do now is add another layer to this. So here we have our stitching. Let's duplicate what we have. So I'm gonna duplicate this layer. And so now we have, both layers are now combining together. And what I'm gonna do here after this paint effect on the layer that's on top is I'm gonna add a filter, and I'm going to add a blur. So let me just do a search here, or just clear out my filter here and choose blur. And then I can come in and just increase this blur intensity. So I'm gonna set it at a value maybe something like this. Now what I'm gonna do is go back to the height here. This is the height channel that's on the fill, and I'm gonna set this from a positive to a negative. And so when I do this, this helps me to create the effect of some indentation where the stitch is being sewn into the leather. So here you can see the difference that we get. Without the indentation layer, you can see, well, the stitches look just like, well, stitches just laying on top, just as they are here with the layer. But now we have this blurred kind of indentation layer underneath of the stitch, which gives the feeling of the stitch actually having some impression on the material itself. And I can adjust this by coming back here to this blur and maybe making it, maybe not as intense. So we'll do something like this here, or I don't know, we'll just keep playing with it a bit till we get the effect that we want. So we'll do something like this here. So here at this stage, we've finished kind of mocking up the materials we would like for this shoe, and now it comes time to, let's just do some type of concept render here of what we have so far. So to do that, I'm going to jump over here into iRay by just clicking this camera icon, and here you can see that I can now do an actual ray traced render. So if I come back here to my background, you can see that I can actually set the background to be a clear color. So right now I'm using an HDR map to light the entire scene, but what I'd like to do is just use a clear color on top of this. I can actually set here, if I come back over to the image, I can choose a different environment map, but here underneath the camera, I can change things like my field of view. I can also activate these post effects. So here in this case, what I'm gonna do is you can see that I have a vignette here applied, which is, just helping me to kind of stylize this overall concept render. I'm also going to enable a glare here, which is going to give me a little bit of post effect bloom. And here you can see I also have a nice contact shadow. Now I can simply just save out this render, and so now I can just save out this render. So as you can see here with Painter, we're able to take the scans from the HPZ 3D camera, bring those into Painter, quickly mock up various materials and textures. We can work in Painter in a procedural manner, which allows us to easily be able to go back and make changes to the materials, the colors, roughness, all these things that we're setting up for our material. And we can iterate very quickly over the types of materials we're creating. Then we can jump right into iRay and do a nice concept render.